Street Fighter is one of the most popular video game franchises in the world, and revolutionized the fighting game genre. It came as no surprise when, in 1994, it was announced that a Street Fighter movie was in production. I don't think anyone expected the film to be an Oscar-worthy masterpiece, but it ended up being so widely panned by critics and fans alike that some have called it one of the worst films ever made. Although the film is notoriously bad, the story behind its making is even more remarkable. It's a miracle the film even made it into cinemas. This is the strange history of Street Fighter, the movie.
Now, who wants to go home and who wants to go with me?
The original Street Fighter arcade game was released by Capcom in 1987. Even though it was considered a success, it was pretty basic compared to its sequels. A few years later, Capcom released Street Fighter II, which arguably became the most famous fighting game of all time, with versions ported to both the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo. It was so popular that ports of this game are still being released. There was even a remake for the Nintendo Switch in 2017 called Ultra Street Fighter II: The Final Challengers. Growing up, I had the Sega Genesis version of this game, known as the Special Champion Edition. My cousin and I played it countless times. We were really young and didn't understand how in-depth the game was. I even remember the first time I executed a Hadouken. It happened completely by accident. One year, my parents got me a Sega Saturn for Christmas, along with Street Fighter the movie The Game. I know the game has a notorious reputation, but I was only 7 years old and it was cool to me. I loved the cutscenes. I had never seen movie cutscenes in a video game before. Before playing this, I had no idea that a Street Fighter movie even existed. The game actually made me want to watch it. There was a gas station near my house that rented VHS tapes. Believe it or not, in a town of about 500 people, they had a copy of Street Fighter the movie. I rented it, watched it, and oh boy, where do I begin? As a 7-year-old fan of Street Fighter, I thought the movie was kinda cool. But as an adult, I see so many flaws in it that I hardly know where to begin. For starters, the main character Guile, the supposed American hero with the flag tattoo on his arm, is played by an actor who clearly isn't American.
$20 billion? What will prevent him from taking more hostages next month?
Beyond the characters, the movie seemed to have little in common with the game at all. I was expecting a martial arts tournament. After all, that's essentially what Street Fighter is about. But the film felt more like a live-action version of the old G.I. Joe cartoon. Had they stuck to the plot, it might have been much better. So what happened? Let's start back at the beginning. The film went into production in 1994 with a budget of just over $30 million. Capcom, the company behind the Street Fighter video game, financed nearly the entire budget and insisted on having final approval over every aspect of production. The film's director and writer was Stephen E. D'Souza, a highly experienced action film writer. His resume included scripts for 48 Hours, Commando, Die Hard, and Die Hard 2. Some of the best action films ever made. However, despite his writing credentials, D'Souza had little directing experience. Before this film, his directing credits were limited to a low-budget film called Arnold's Wrecking Crew and an episode of Tales of the Crypt. This project would be by far his biggest undertaking. D'Souza was a huge fan of the games. He spent countless hours in arcades, knew all the characters and their moves, and deeply wanted to direct the film. In fact, the only reason he agreed to write the script was on the condition that Capcom let him direct. The producers accepted his terms, but Capcom wanted the film produced quickly. So much so that D'Souza drafted the entire outline in just one night. When asked why he chose not to make the movie more like the game, D'Souza cited the Super Mario Bros. Film, which had recently come out, receiving overwhelmingly negative reviews and was a financial failure. I've seen the Super Mario Bros. Film, and just like the Street Fighter movie, I didn't think it had much in common with the game either. In contrast, the other Mario Bros. Film that came out in 2023 was very faithful to the game and became a huge hit. It was one of the biggest films of the year. When making a movie based on a popular video game, the audience is mostly composed of fans who expect the film to be faithful to the game. This is why I'm surprised when studios stray from the source material. Resident Evil is perhaps the best example. The game was extremely popular, so they made a movie. Yet the main character in the film series isn't even from any of the Resident Evil games. It turns out the main reason the G.I. Joe style plot was chosen was that Capcom was working on a line of action figures featuring soldier characters. There was a plan to use the movie as a marketing tool for these new toys, much like how the G.I. Joe cartoon primarily served to sell action figures. In fact, Hasbro, the company behind the G.I. Joe toys, was set to manufacture the Street Fighter figures, and the decision to depict the characters as soldiers stemmed from Hasbro's original designs for G.I. Joe. Capcom was also a fan of James Bond, and requested that the film incorporate many elements from that series. Specifically, they wanted M. Bison to have a giant evil lair reminiscent of a typical Bond villain's hideout. So in a way, we can't blame D'Souza too much. His hands were tied by Capcom, and he had to deliver the film that they demanded. It's important to remember that this was still the early years of the Street Fighter franchise. At the time, Capcom claimed they wanted to steer Street Fighter in a new direction, with the characters being treated more like superheroes. Another request from Capcom was to ensure that the film included every character from Street Fighter. Originally, D'Souza planned to include no more than 7 characters, explaining that studies had shown films with more than 7 characters tend to confuse audiences. He cited Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and the Magnificent Seven as examples. At first, Capcom agreed, but as pre-production began, they demanded that D'Souza include additional characters to boost merchandise opportunities. However, he was also required to keep the film to a runtime of just an hour and 40 minutes, which meant there wasn't enough time to properly develop each character. Consequently, some plot elements were added merely as an excuse just to showcase another Street Fighter character. D'Souza ended up rewriting the entire script multiple times just to accommodate these additional characters. For example, in the movie, Chun-Li is portrayed as a reporter instead of the Interpol officer she is in the game. Boxer Balrog is regulated to being Chun-Li's cameraman, and sumo wrestler Hondo works as a sound technician, and the character DJ is reduced to merely being Bison's IT guy. Of the 16 playable Street Fighter characters, 15 appear in the game. The only character missing is Fei Long. Capcom actually approached D'Souza and asked him to include Fei Long, but they waited until the film was nearly complete, at which point D'Souza insisted that it was impossible to add him. The plot of Street Fighter II involves fighters from around the world competing in a tournament hosted by the evil M. Bison, who plans to take over the world. In the film, Bison is reimagined as a drug lord who has seized control of a small country and is holding 63 aid workers hostage, demanding $20 billion for their release. Colonel Guile of the Allied Nations, an obvious nod to the United Nations, vows to defeat Bison and rescue the hostages. When it came time to cast the film, Capcom initially wanted a huge star like Arnold or Sylvester Stallone. However, once they learned that they couldn't afford either of those, they requested the actor from Bloodsport, Jean-Claude Van Damme. Although he fit the budget, D'Souza was confused. Van Damme was Belgian, and Capcom wanted him to portray the quintessential American hero, Guile. Since Capcom was based in Japan, they had always seen Van Damme's films dubbed. They didn't realize how noticeable his accent was. In an attempt to explain Guile's accent, D'Souza added a line stating that Guile had grown up in New Orleans and that his parents spoke French Creole, but ultimately that line was cut from the film. It also turned out that they could only afford to cast Van Damme on a part-time basis. so he would be available on set for only a limited number of days. Ryu is the most famous character in Street Fighter, yet in the film he only plays a supporting role and is portrayed by Byron Mann, who was a relative unknown at the time. In fact, Capcom initially didn't want Mann for the role. They had their eye on actor Kenya Sawada, a devoted fan of Street Fighter who had appeared in several commercials. However, Sawada spoke only limited English, and D'Souza had to plead with Capcom to let him keep Mann as Ryu. Capcom eventually agreed, but insisted that D'Souza create a character just for Sawada so that he could still be part of the film.
Colonel, my commando team is at full readiness, but we need to know if the assault will be by land, sea, or air.
Another relatively unknown actor, Damian Chapa, was chosen to play Ken, and just like Van Damme, Chapa bore very little resemblance to the character that he was meant to portray. Wes Studi portrayed Sagat, the character known for his eye patch, and had recently appeared in 2 award-winning films, The Last of the Mohicans and Dances with Wolves. Studi had difficulty moving around with the eye patch and often lost his balance. It was so problematic that a crew member even drilled a tiny hole in the eye patch to allow Studi to see. Even though Van Damme was the star of the film, the performance that truly stole the show was Raul Julia, who was cast as the antagonist M. Bison. Many have claimed that Julia's performance was the film's only redeeming quality. At the time, Julia was in poor health due to stomach cancer, but agreed to appear in the film because his children enjoyed playing the Street Fighter games. Tragically, Julia passed away just a month after the film's release. Ming-Na Wen, who played Chun-Li, hated working on the film so much that she refused to star in another action movie for years, eventually returning to the genre in recent times when she appeared in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and The Mandalorian. So what made Wen's experience so unbearable? For starters, Van Damme was extremely difficult to work with. According to director D'Souza, Van Damme was under the influence of cocaine for most of the production. He frequently called out sick, and on 2 occasions he went on trips to Hong Kong, disappearing for days. It was even reported that Van Damme used about $10,000 worth of cocaine each week. The production team had to hire someone whose sole responsibility was to ensure that Van Damme arrived on set each day. Unfortunately, the person they hired to basically babysit Van Damme also struggled with a cocaine problem. It was also rumored that Van Damme and Kylie Minogue had an affair while in Thailand. By the way, the story of how Kylie Minogue was cast in this movie is unbelievable. As the production crew was on a plane headed for Australia to begin filming, they suddenly realized they had forgotten to cast the role of Cammy. While on the plane, D'Souza spotted a magazine featuring Australian singer and actress Kylie Minogue on the cover and decided that she would be perfect for Cammy. In contrast to Wen and D'Souza, actor Byron Mann later claimed that he had a wonderful time working on the film, saying it felt like a vacation. A large portion of the filming took place in Thailand, a country with many beautiful locations, but also extreme heat. One line producer even suffered a heart attack during filming, and the heat was so intense that crew members sweated so much they began to lose weight. Additionally, most of the crew did not enjoy the food in Thailand, and several people suffered from food poisoning. One crew member even developed a skin infection after filming a scene in a local river. Another producer forgot which side of the road to drive on in Thailand and crashed into oncoming traffic. Thailand also lacked the infrastructure to support all the equipment the crew was using. The local power station even shut down under the strain of the electricity needed. There's even a story about a soundstage used by the production crew that had a tin roof. Every time it rained, which was almost every day, the stage became unusable because the sound of the rain on the roof was unbearably loud. The stage itself was in poor condition with cracks and holes in every wall. To make matters even worse, during filming, the government of Thailand grew concerned about a potential rebel uprising and shut down all the roads, making filming nearly impossible. the cast and crew had to resort to using boats to get around. The original plan for the film's conclusion was to have a swarm of helicopters attack Bison's base, but the Thai government informed the producers that due to the threat of a rebel uprising, helicopters were forbidden. Once again, D'Souza had to rewrite the script to devise a new ending. Filming was further complicated by the fact that aside from Van Damme, almost none of the cast had any experience with martial arts. Think about that for a second. Street Fighter is about the world's greatest warriors, yet the producers cast actors with little to no fighting experience. With the production being rushed, there was no time to train anyone. The actors had to learn all the moves on set during filming. In one scene, Byron Mann's character Ryu has to participate in a sword fight, even though Mann had never held a sword in his life. And it wasn't even a plastic prop, it was a real sword. Mann later said he ended up asking a stuntman for tips and was terrified he might accidentally hurt someone. By the time filming in Thailand wrapped, production was 15 days behind schedule. D'Souza asked Capcom to push the film's release date back so they'd have more time, but Capcom refused. They wanted the film released before Christmas '94 to maximize toy sales. To save time, D'Souza split the production team into two groups. He would film the dialogue-heavy scenes, while the stunt team handled the action sequences. The problem was that none of the stunt team members were fans of Street Fighter, so they never filmed any of the special moves the game is famous for. When production finally ended, D'Souza was so far behind that he still had 20 pages of the script left to film, about 1/5 of the movie. Initially, Capcom expected him to work with the existing footage to complete the film. But when that proved impossible, they sent the crew to Vancouver, Canada, and there the sets were rebuilt and the team was given just 3 days to finish the movie. After D'Souza submitted the film to the MPAA, it received an R rating. A huge problem since the target audience was mainly kids and teenagers. D'Souza was contractually obligated to make Street Fighter PG-13, so he had to re-edit the film. It was originally planned that Ryu would use his famous Hadouken move in his fight against Vega, but because of all these edits, that special effect was cut. You can even see the part where the Hadouken was supposed to happen. When D'Souza finally resubmitted the film, the MPAA changed the rating from R to PG. Apparently D'Souza had cut too much violence. Lacking time for another re-edit, he asked Van Damme to record a voiceover containing a few swear words to bump the rating back up to PG-13. This all happened just weeks before the film was slated to premiere. MC Hammer recorded one of the soundtrack songs and was scheduled to appear at the film's premiere. He did show up, but not to watch the film. In fact, he didn't even get out of his car. Instead, he drove by the theater blasting his song on his car stereo. Apparently, he was only contractually obligated to appear, but wasn't required to actually do anything. Even though the film was widely panned, it still turned a profit, earning almost $100 million against its $30 million budget. There was even talk of a potential sequel. Actor Dolph Lundgren, who starred with Van Damme in Universal Soldier, claimed he had even been offered a part in the sequel. Eventually, that film never materialized, but in 2009, a low-budget film titled Street Fighter: The Legend of Chun-Li was released, and it was considered so bad that Looper.com said it made the original Street Fighter film look like Citizen Kane and The Godfather. I will say that after watching this film multiple times while working on this script and knowing everything that happened on the set, I don't hate the film. It isn't great by any means, but I still enjoyed it because I found it unintentionally funny at times. A year after the release of Street Fighter the movie, a film based on Mortal Kombat was released. At the time, Mortal Kombat was Street Fighter's biggest competitor, but unlike the Street Fighter film, Mortal Kombat's plot was based entirely on the story featured in the games. It ended up making over $20 million more at the box office than Street Fighter, despite being filmed on an even smaller budget. Let me know in the comments if you've ever seen Street Fighter the movie and what you thought of it. And as always, thank you for watching.